It was February 1943, and a Red Army sergeant named Vasily Chuikov stumbled out of a collapsed building in the Stalingrad factory district with his hands wrapped in blackened rags that had once been gloves. Behind him, the ruins of what German maps still labeled the Bagration ordnance factory stretched across a moonscape of rubble so total that veterans who had fought at Verdun said they had never seen anything like it. The sergeant had survived 163 days in a city that had been declared dead 100 times. He had eaten newspaper. He had drunk water from shell craters. He had watched entire companies disappear into the rubble in the space of a single afternoon, not routed, not retreating, simply gone, swallowed by something that no longer resembled war in any familiar sense. As Soviet forces tightened the ring around the encircled German Sixth Army that winter, Chuikov was brought before an intelligence officer and asked a single question that hundreds of Red Army survivors would be asked in the months that followed: what did you learn about how German officers fight? The sergeant answered without hesitation. He said the same thing every survivor said. And what he described was so consistent, so uniform across thousands of separate testimonies collected from men who had never spoken to each other, that Soviet intelligence analysts flagged it in classified reports that would not be seen by Western historians for 50 years. This is the story of what those survivors said, why German officers in that battle made a series of decisions that stunned even their own high command, and how the answer to that question revealed something about the nature of military leadership that no staff college in the world had anticipated. To understand what Soviet soldiers kept saying about German officers, you must first understand what the German officer corps believed about itself in the summer of 1942. The Wehrmacht had conquered Poland in 5 weeks. It had overrun France in 6. It had driven the British into the sea at Dunkirk. It had pushed the Red Army back 800 miles in the first 5 months of Operation Barbarossa, capturing more than 3 million Soviet soldiers in a series of encirclements so vast and so rapid that military historians ran out of vocabulary to describe them. German officers had been trained since the early 19th century in a doctrine called Auftragstaktik, mission-oriented tactics, a system that gave subordinate commanders extraordinary latitude to achieve their objectives by whatever means they judged best. A German company commander did not wait for orders when he saw an opportunity. He acted. A battalion commander did not request permission to exploit a breakthrough. He drove through it and reported afterward. This flexibility, this cascading initiative at every level of command, had been the secret engine of every German victory. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, arguably the most gifted operational mind the German army possessed, wrote after the war that Auftragstaktik was not merely a tactical system. It was a philosophy of command rooted in the belief that no plan survives contact with the enemy, and that the officer closest to the problem must be trusted to solve it. Soviet military doctrine in 1942 operated from precisely the opposite premise. Stalin's purges of 1937 and 1938 had executed or imprisoned approximately 35,000 Red Army officers, including 3 of its 5 marshals, 13 of its 15 army commanders, and 50 of its 57 corps commanders. The men who replaced them were politically reliable, which meant they were institutionally terrified. A Soviet officer who deviated from orders risked not just his career but his life. The system produced paralysis at exactly the moments when initiative mattered most. German intelligence reports from 1941 described Soviet defensive formations that stood and died in place because no officer below divisional level dared order a withdrawal without written authorization from above, even when their positions had been outflanked hours earlier. In the early battles of Barbarossa, entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed not because they were outfought but because they were outdecided, because the German officers attacking them were making decisions in minutes that Soviet officers needed hours or days to process through a chain of command that had been deliberately crippled. This was the context in which Operation Blue, the German summer offensive of 1942, was launched toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the river city of Stalingrad. Army Group South descended on the Soviet positions in the bend of the Don River in late June with a speed and coordination that seemed to confirm every lesson of the previous year. Soviet formations shattered. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners streamed westward toward German cages. The Sixth Army under Friedrich Paulus reached the outskirts of Stalingrad by the 3rd week of August 1942, and German officers at every level believed they were looking at a city that would fall within days. They were wrong in a way that would change the history of the 20th century. What happened at Stalingrad between August 1942 and February 1943 was not simply a military defeat. It was a systematic reversal of the assumptions that had made the German army the most effective fighting force on earth. And the reversal began with a decision made not in Berlin or at Wehrmacht headquarters, but by a Soviet general named Vasily Chuikov, who had been assigned to hold the city with whatever forces remained and who understood something about urban warfare that no German planner had factored into their calculations. Chuikov's insight was devastatingly simple. The German tactical system depended on distance. It depended on the ability to separate elements of the German combined arms team, to use artillery and air power to destroy a position before infantry closed in, and to use mobile exploitation forces to drive deep into rear areas once a gap opened. Every German victory since Poland had been won by maintaining that system, by keeping enough space between the German attacker and the Soviet defender that the full weight of German firepower could be applied before the decisive engagement. Chuikov decided to eliminate the distance. He ordered his units to close with the Germans so tightly, to maintain physical contact so intimately, that German artillery and the feared Stuka dive bombers could not fire without killing their own men. He called it hugging tactics. His officers called it riding on the Germans' backs. Soviet squads of 8 to 10 men, trained as what Chuikov called storm groups, infiltrated through the ruins to positions within grenade-throwing range of German units, then held those positions day and night, forcing every German tactical decision into a narrow corridor of close-quarters combat where Auftragstaktik and combined arms doctrine were largely irrelevant. The effect on German officer decision-making was immediate and severe. German officers in Stalingrad were trained to think in terms of maneuver and exploitation. They were trained to identify a weakness, direct combined arms assets against it, create a rupture, and drive through before the defense could reconsolidate. In the ruins of Stalingrad, there were no weaknesses to identify, no flanks to turn, no rear areas to exploit. There was only the next building, and the building after that, and the building after that, each one a separate battle, each one requiring decisions that no staff officer in Germany had ever gamed out in an exercise. Testimonies collected by Soviet intelligence from captured German officers in the winter of 1942 reveal the psychological dimension of this disorientation with remarkable clarity. An Oberst from the 71st Infantry Division, captured in November during the Soviet encirclement, told his interrogators that he had commanded men in France, in Yugoslavia, and on the Eastern Front before Stalingrad, and that in each of those theaters he had understood what was happening around him, had been able to form a mental picture of the battle and make decisions based on that picture. In Stalingrad, he said, he had no picture. He had only the floor above him, which the Soviets held, and the floor below him, which his men held, and a staircase between them that changed hands 17 times in 3 days. He could not coordinate with his adjacent units because his adjacent units were separated from him by streets that functioned as kill zones. He could not request air support because the Soviets were 30 meters away. He could not withdraw without orders he could not receive because his communications had been cut. He simply held and watched his men die and waited for a situation that never clarified. This testimony was not unique. Soviet intelligence compiled similar accounts from hundreds of officers and NCOs across every German formation that fought in Stalingrad, and when analysts looked at the pattern, they found something that surprised them. The German officers who adapted to Stalingrad, the ones who kept their units cohesive and fighting through months of that particular hell, had not been the ones who tried to apply German doctrine to an urban environment. They had been the ones who abandoned doctrine entirely and improvised. They had decentralized command to the squad and section level in ways that went far beyond what Auftragstaktik formally sanctioned. They had established resupply routes through sewers and rubble tunnels. They had created informal communication networks using runners and signal mirrors because their radios were useless in the electromagnetic chaos of the ruins. They had done, in other words, exactly what Auftragstaktik was designed to enable, but they had done it under conditions so extreme that the doctrine's original architects would not have recognized it. The German officers who broke were the ones who tried to impose order on Stalingrad, who kept waiting for the battle to return to a form they had been trained to handle. They were the ones who sent runners to headquarters asking for guidance and then waited for answers that never came instead of making decisions with the information they had. They were the ones who, in the words of one Soviet intelligence summary, behaved as if they were playing a game whose rules they expected to be restored at any moment, rather than understanding that the rules had been permanently changed. The operational dimension of the German command failure at Stalingrad was understood in Hitler's headquarters almost from the beginning, but in a way that made the catastrophe worse rather than better. Hitler had given personal attention to the capture of the city that bore Stalin's name since August, and as the fighting dragged into October and November without the decisive result that German command had promised, he tightened his grip on the tactical decisions of formations that were supposed to be making those decisions themselves. A directive issued in September 1942 reduced the operational latitude of corps and divisional commanders to a degree that violated every principle of the Auftragstaktik system. Units that had broken through to the Volga riverbank were forbidden to consolidate their gains and pull back to defensible positions for the winter, as their own officers recommended, because Hitler had decided that holding every meter of ground already captured was a strategic imperative. German officers who argued against this directive were relieved. Those who remained learned to send reports that did not contradict the headquarters' picture of the situation, even when that picture had nothing to do with the reality they were living. What this created in practice was a command system that had the vocabulary of German military tradition but none of its substance. Orders came down from Berlin through a chain of transmission that stripped them of any acknowledgement of tactical reality. Officers in the ruins received directives to capture objectives that no longer existed as buildings, to hold lines that had been erased by Soviet counterattacks, to coordinate with units that had ceased to exist. The gap between the orders and the situation was so extreme that many German officers began, in the testimony of multiple Soviet interrogation reports, to simply stop reading them. They fought the battle in front of them, reported upward what their superiors wanted to hear, and tried to survive. This was not Auftragstaktik. This was not German military tradition. This was the disintegration of an institutional system under pressure so extreme that the system's own logic turned against it. When the Soviet encirclement was completed on November 23, 1942, trapping approximately 330,000 German and Axis soldiers inside the Stalingrad pocket, the command crisis became absolute. Paulus was promoted to Field Marshal on January 30, 1943, the same day he was implicitly expected to die rather than surrender, in keeping with the German military tradition that no Field Marshal had ever been taken prisoner. He surrendered the following day. The testimonies collected from surviving German officers in the weeks after the encirclement reveal a uniformity of observation that Soviet analysts found almost eerie. Officers who had commanded companies and battalions in the pocket described, in separate sessions with separate interrogators, using nearly identical language, the same fundamental experience. They described a battle in which their training had given them no relevant preparation. They described an officer development system that had produced extraordinary tactical thinking and zero institutional preparation for the specific conditions of urban combat at this scale. They described, above all, a command culture that had turned the German army's greatest strength against itself, because the decentralized initiative that was the engine of every German victory required two things that Stalingrad removed: the operational space to maneuver, and the freedom from above to make decisions. Without those two things, the German officer who had been trained to be the most dangerous man on any battlefield became, in the words of one Soviet intelligence summary that remained classified until 1993, a man with magnificent reflexes and no opponent to use them on. The Red Army that emerged from Stalingrad was almost unrecognizable compared to the force that had fled in disorder 18 months earlier. The same political constraints on initiative that had crippled Soviet decision-making in 1941 had been partially relaxed under the brutal pressure of survival. Chuikov's experience at Stalingrad, where squad-level decisions had repeatedly been the difference between holding a position and losing it, was absorbed into Red Army training doctrine with a speed that surprised even Soviet planners. Between February and July 1943, the Red Army retrained approximately 120 frontline divisions using lessons drawn directly from the Stalingrad urban combat. The specific innovations that Chuikov's men had developed, the storm groups, the saw routes, the technique of occupying the top floor of a building while fighting to prevent the Germans from doing the same, were codified in training manuals and distributed through the force in a matter of months. German military intelligence monitored this adaptation process with growing concern. Reports from the Eastern Front through the spring of 1943 noted changes in Soviet tactical behavior that had no precedent in earlier engagements. Soviet officers below divisional level were making decisions and acting on them without waiting for authorization from above. Soviet units were showing lateral coordination, sharing information across formation boundaries in ways that had been essentially absent in 1941. Soviet defensive positions were being constructed with a sophistication that reflected a genuine understanding of how German attacks were structured, rather than simply concentrating forces at the expected direction of main effort. These changes were not explained by any fundamental shift in the political system, which remained as dangerous for initiative as it had always been, but by the simple brutal fact that enough Soviet officers had now survived enough combat to have an empirical understanding of what worked, and some of that understanding had been transmitted upward into doctrine. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 demonstrated the scale of the transformation. German planning for the operation, the largest armored offensive in history, had been developed using assumptions about Soviet command behavior that were accurate for 1941 and completely wrong for 1943. German planners expected the Soviet defensive formations in the Kursk salient to respond to initial breakthroughs in the manner of previous years, committing reserves piecemeal, failing to coordinate counterattacks, collapsing under the pressure of deep armored penetration. Instead, they encountered a defense in depth of such sophistication that German forces, including elite SS panzer formations with the most powerful tanks in the world, were unable to achieve the operational breakthroughs their plans required. The Soviet defensive system at Kursk incorporated lessons drawn explicitly from the Stalingrad experience. Anti-tank guns were positioned not at the front of the defensive line, where they would face the full weight of the German armor, but at depth, so that German tanks that penetrated the first line found themselves entering pre-prepared killing grounds covered by weapons they had not yet identified. Soviet artillery, coordinated at a level of sophistication that had been absent in 1941, fired counter-battery missions against German gun positions with accuracy that German observers attributed initially to intelligence leaks, before concluding that the Red Army had developed new methods of identifying artillery positions through sound ranging and flash observation. The German officer who had looked at the Red Army in 1941 and seen a mass of brave but badly led soldiers was looking in 1943 at something that had learned from its own catastrophe at a rate that no European military tradition had produced. The Soviet soldiers who were asked what they had learned about German officers gave answers that consistently pointed to the same thing: not weakness in the individual officers, not lack of courage, not lack of tactical skill, but a structural vulnerability in a command system that had been so successful for so long that it had not been forced to confront its own limitations. They said the German officers fought brilliantly in the battle they had prepared for and catastrophically in the battle they hadn't. They said German officers at Stalingrad looked like men who had been given an instruction manual for a machine that no longer existed. They said German officers who survived Stalingrad came out the other side changed in ways that were visible, slower in some ways, more careful, less certain that their training had given them everything they needed. Some of them, the Soviet soldiers said, became very dangerous in a new way. They had traded the confidence of a man who believes his system is perfect for the adaptability of a man who knows it isn't. The question that Soviet intelligence analysts were actually trying to answer was not what made German officers formidable in a city. It was what made them formidable on the Eastern Front when everything went according to their plan, and what it would take to ensure that their plan never went according to plan again. The answers that came back from hundreds of separate testimonies pointed toward a doctrine of deliberate disorganization. The systematic disruption of German command communications, the forcing of German units into close terrain where combined arms coordination became difficult, the maintenance of enough pressure at all points of a German position that the German officer's famous ability to concentrate force against the decisive point was neutralized before it could be applied. These lessons were applied directly to Soviet operational planning for the remainder of the war. The Red Army of 1944, which overran German defensive positions in Belarus in Operation Bagration with losses that shocked even the Soviet high command in their modesty, was fighting a German officer corps that had been under systematic pressure to exhaust its adaptive capacity since Stalingrad. German officers who might have developed the kind of improvisational brilliance that Chuikov's men had shown were being asked to hold positions they could not hold with resources that did not exist, under a command philosophy that had been telling them since 1942 that withdrawal was treason. The German army that had terrified the world with its military innovation had become, by 1944, one of the most static defensive forces of the war, not because its officers were worse but because the system in which they operated had ceased to permit the flexibility that made them dangerous. The last survivors of Stalingrad, the German prisoners who walked east into Soviet captivity in February 1943, provide a final frame for the question that Soviet intelligence had been asking. Of the approximately 91,000 men who surrendered at Stalingrad, only about 6,000 returned to Germany after the war. Most died in Soviet captivity of disease, malnutrition, and exposure, conditions that the Soviet Union's own resources after 2 years of war could barely alleviate. The officers among them occupied a particular position in the Soviet camp system, studied and observed with an intensity that reflected the military intelligence value they were still believed to carry even in captivity. What the Soviet interrogators found, in the transcripts that were declassified in fragments through the 1990s and in the comprehensive release of 2001, was not the arrogance or the certainty that the caricature of the German officer projected. They found men who were trying to understand what had happened to them, who were asking the same question from the inside that Soviet intelligence was asking from the outside: how had the finest officer corps in the world, trained in the finest military tradition in the world, walked into a city and never found their way out? The answer that emerges from the documents, from the interrogation transcripts and the post-war memoirs and the declassified after-action reports, is not simple, and it is not flattering to any of the parties involved. The German officer at Stalingrad had been made by a system so successful that it had never been forced to develop immunity to its own failure modes. The Auftragstaktik that was supposed to free every officer to find the solution that doctrine had not anticipated turned out, under sufficient pressure, to require the same operational freedom it had always required. Strip away that freedom, as Hitler's directives did from the autumn of 1942 onward, and what remained was an officer who understood perfectly how to operate a system that no longer existed. The Soviet officer who learned from Stalingrad had been educated by catastrophe in a way that the German officer, precisely because of his army's early success, had not. The school that taught the Red Army everything it needed to know about modern war was the one that nearly destroyed it. The 163 days in the ruins cost the Soviet Union more casualties than the United States suffered in the entire war. What it purchased was the empirical knowledge that no peacetime training had been able to provide. The sergeant who stumbled out of the Bagration factory with blackened rags for gloves had learned something that no German war college had taught and no Soviet political officer had been able to convey. He had learned that the officer who adapts to the battle he is actually in, rather than the battle he has been prepared for, is the one who survives to be asked what he learned. And when Soviet intelligence sat him down and asked that question, his answer was the same as every other survivor's answer. He said the German officers were brilliant until the moment they were not, and that the moment they were not was the moment the battle stopped being the battle they had trained for and became the battle that existed. The transcripts are preserved in archives in Moscow that remain only partially accessible to Western researchers. The testimonies of the German prisoners are held in collections that German historians began examining seriously only in the early 2000s. The full story of what both sides learned from Stalingrad, and how those lessons shaped the remainder of the war and the military doctrines of every major power for the generation that followed, is still being assembled from fragments in 3 languages. But the core of what the survivors said is clear enough, and it is clear enough to stand as one of the most significant observations about military command that the 20th century produced. Excellence in a system is not the same as resilience in conditions that the system was not designed to handle. The finest officer corps in the world, trained in the finest military tradition in the world, discovered that its greatness was partly a function of circumstances that Stalingrad permanently altered. And the army that had been designed to exploit every weakness of every opponent turned out to have a weakness of its own, which was that it had never truly had to confront one. That is what every Soviet soldier who survived Stalingrad said about German officers. And every one of them was right. If this story reached you the way it was meant to, take a moment to like and subscribe. History is carried by the people who refuse to forget it, and this community is proof of that. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. We read every one.